June 12, 1946. The locomotive sat on the tracks outside the displaced persons camp in Bavaria, its engine idling with a steady mechanical heartbeat that echoed across the platform. Steam rose into the morning air, dissipating into a sky that promised rain. The train had been sitting there for 2 hours, fully loaded with supplies, fueled and ready for the journey east. Everything was prepared according to protocol. The paperwork had been filed, the manifests checked, the route approved by both American and Soviet liaison officers. All that remained was for the passengers to board. But the 43 German prisoners designated for repatriation to the Soviet occupation zone had not moved from where they sat on the platform, their arms linked together in a human chain of quiet desperation. Captain William Morrison stood 10 feet away, holding a clipboard with the repatriation orders, feeling the weight of the papers in his hands grow heavier with each passing minute. He was 32 years old, had fought his way across France and into Germany, had helped liberate 2 concentration camps, and had spent the last 14 months believing that his work processing prisoners for return to their homeland was the final act of a just war. The Americans had defeated tyranny. Now they were restoring order, reuniting families, sending soldiers back to rebuild their country. That was the narrative he had told himself every day as he signed discharge papers and loaded transport trains. But standing here, watching grown men weep openly while refusing to board a train that would take them home, Morrison felt that narrative beginning to crack. The prisoners ranged in age from early 20s to late 50s. Some wore the remnants of Wehrmacht uniforms. Others had been given civilian clothes by the Red Cross. All of them shared the same expression, not defiance, not anger, but a bone-deep terror that seemed to radiate from them like heat. A few had their heads bowed, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Others stared at the train as if it were a death sentence made manifest in steel and steam. One man, whose name Morrison knew was Klaus Müller, held a photograph clutched against his chest, his knuckles white from the pressure of his grip. Morrison had tried reasoning with them. He had explained through his translator, Corporal Heinrich Fischer, that the war was over, that international agreements required their return, that they would be processed and allowed to return to their families. He had shown them the official documents, the stamps and signatures that proved this was a legitimate repatriation, sanctioned by the highest levels of Allied command. He had even offered assurances that the Soviets had agreed to treat returning prisoners according to the Geneva Convention standards. But his words seemed to pass through the men without landing, as if the language of official policy had no meaning in the face of whatever they believed awaited them on the other side of the journey. Sergeant Thomas Blake approached Morrison, his young face troubled. Blake was 23, had been in Europe for 18 months, and had the earnest quality of someone who still believed that wars had clear endings and clear victories. "Sir," he said quietly, "the engineer's asking how long we're going to wait. He has a schedule to keep." Morrison looked at Blake, then at the prisoners, then at the 6 American soldiers standing nearby who would be responsible for loading these men if they continued to refuse. Those soldiers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact with the prisoners. They had not signed up to be jailers. They had signed up to fight fascism. Morrison opened his mouth to give the order to begin forcibly boarding the prisoners, but the words stuck in his throat. Something about this felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He had been in the army long enough to know that following orders was not optional, that the chain of command existed for a reason, that his personal feelings about a situation were irrelevant compared to his duty. But he had also been alive long enough to recognize the look of genuine terror when he saw it, and these men were terrified of something specific, something that made remaining prisoners in American custody seem preferable to freedom in their own country. "Give me 10 minutes, Morrison told Blake. "I want to talk to the translator again. I want to understand what they're actually saying to each other." Blake nodded and stepped back, looking relieved to have the decision delayed. Morrison walked over to where Corporal Fischer stood near the prisoners, close enough to hear their whispered conversations in German. Fischer was a German Jewish soldier who had fled to America in 1938, returned as a liberator, and now served as one of the camp's primary translators. His face showed a complexity of emotions that Morrison was just beginning to understand, sympathy mixed with confusion, and underneath it all, something that looked like dread. Heinrich, Morrison said quietly. What are they saying? Not the official statements. What are they actually saying to each other? Fischer listened for a moment to the low murmur of German voices, his expression growing darker. Then he turned to Morrison and translated in a voice that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. They are saying that the train goes east, but they will never arrive home. They are saying that men who return to Soviet territory have disappeared. They are saying their families sent warnings not to come back. They are saying the Soviets arrest anyone who spent time in American custody, accuse them of being spies or collaborators. They are saying that what waits for them in the East is not liberation, but another kind of prison, one where the Americans cannot protect them. Dat Treasurer. Fischer paused, his jaw tight. Sir, they are saying they would rather die here than board that train. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked at the men on the platform with new eyes, seeing not obstinate prisoners refusing orders, but men making a calculated choice between two forms of captivity, choosing the one where they might survive. As the translator's words sank in, Morrison began to understand that this moment on a railway platform in Bavaria was not about discipline or duty or following protocol. This was about men who had information he didn't have, men who knew something about the peace that the official reports weren't telling him. And as Captain Morrison stood on the platform trying to understand the prisoner's refusal, a translator finally arrived with a stack of letters that would change everything. Fischer had been collecting them for weeks, he explained, not sure what to do with them, hoping they were exaggerated or false, but unable to ignore their consistency. These were letters that had been smuggled back through the displaced persons network, passed hand to hand across occupation zones, carried by refugees and black market traders and anyone willing to risk Soviet checkpoints to get messages west. Morrison took the first letter Fischer offered him. It was written on thin paper, the ink smudged in places as if water had touched it, or tears. The handwriting was careful but shaky, the work of someone writing under stress or in hiding. Fischer translated as Morrison read, "To whoever receives this, do not let them send you east. I was repatriated to the Soviet sector in March. They took us off the train at the border and separated anyone who had been held by Americans or British. They accused us of collaboration. They said we had been compromised by Western intelligence. I'm writing this from a holding facility outside Berlin. We are told we will be sent to labor camps in the East for re-education. My friend who tried to protest was taken away. No one has seen him since. If you have any way to stay in American custody, do it. This is not freedom. This is a different kind of death." The letter was unsigned, which made sense. Anyone caught writing such things would face immediate consequences. Morrison set it down and picked up another. This one was dated April and came from somewhere near Dresden. The writer described Soviet authorities going door to door, asking about family members who had been prisoners of war in the West, demanding to know what they had told their captors, what they had seen, whether they had been recruited. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Anyone who couldn't account for their time in Western custody was detained for questioning that could last weeks or months. The writer's brother had been taken 3 weeks earlier, and no one knew where he was. A third letter came from a woman whose husband had been repatriated in February. She wrote that he had arrived home safely, but was arrested within a week, accused of spying for the Americans because he spoke some English he had learned in the prisoner of war camp. She had not been allowed to see him. She had heard rumors that men in his situation were being sent to camps in Siberia, places where the cold and work would kill them within months. She begged anyone reading her letter not to let their loved ones be sent back, to find any way to keep them in the West, where they might have a chance at survival. Morrison read letter after letter, and with each one, the careful structure of post-war order he had believed in began to crumble. These were not propaganda or exaggerations. They were desperate warnings from people who had no reason to lie and every reason to stay silent. The consistency of the accounts was what made them impossible to dismiss: the immediate separation at the border, the accusations of collaboration, the disappearances, the camps in the East. The Yalta Agreement had divided Germany into occupation zones and required the return of all displaced persons and prisoners to their areas of origin. It was supposed to be humanitarian, a way to restore order and reunite families. But these letters suggested that the agreement had created a trap, a mechanism that delivered vulnerable people directly into the hands of a system that viewed them as threats. Fisher pulled out one more letter, this one different from the others. It was addressed specifically to Klaus Müller, the man sitting on the platform clutching the photograph. "This arrived last week," Fisher said quietly. "Klaus has been carrying it ever since. I think you should know what it says." The letter was from Klaus's younger brother, Ernst, who had been repatriated in January. The message was brief, written in the desperate shorthand of someone who knew their communication might be intercepted. "Brother, if you receive this, do not come home. They are taking everyone who returns from the West. Father was questioned for 3 days about you. Mother is frightened. I am in hiding. I write this knowing it may be the last thing I do. Tell the Americans that sending us here is not mercy. Stay where you are. Live if you can." Morrison looked up from the letter to where Klaus sat on the platform, still holding that photograph, and understood now what it was. Not just a family picture, but the last image Klaus had of his brother before Ernst had been sent back to what he believed was his death. The photograph wasn't hope. It was grief held in the hands because there was nowhere else to put it. Morrison felt something shift inside him, a fundamental reordering of how he understood his role here. For 14 months, he had been processing repatriations, believing he was helping people go home. These letters suggested he had been doing something else entirely, feeding people into a system that would destroy them for the crime of having been in Western custody. Sergeant Blake appeared at Morrison's side again, this time looking more uncertain. "Sir, Command is asking for a status report. They want to know why the train hasn't departed." Morrison looked at the letters in his hands, then at the prisoners on the platform, then at the train idling uselessly on the tracks. He had a choice to make, and it was one that would define not just this moment but his understanding of what justice meant in the aftermath of war. He could follow orders, force these men onto the train, complete the repatriation as planned, and file his report stating that the operation had been carried out according to protocol. Or he could acknowledge what these letters were telling him, that following orders in this case meant becoming complicit in something that violated every principle he thought he had been fighting for. "Tell Command there's a delay," Morrison said finally. "Tell them we have information that requires review before we proceed." Blake nodded and hurried away, looking grateful to be given a task that didn't involve forcing terrified men onto trains. Morrison turned back to the prisoners, and this time when he looked at them, he saw something different. Not obstacles to efficiency or problems to be solved, but men who understood something about the peace that he was only beginning to grasp, that the war's end had not brought safety for everyone, and that sometimes the only way to survive liberation was to refuse it. The translator stood beside him, still holding the stack of letters, waiting to see what Morrison would do with the terrible knowledge they contained. Morrison gathered his officers in the camp commandant's office 30 minutes later, the letters spread across the desk like evidence at a trial. Major Edward Garrett, the camp commander, stood with his arms crossed, looking at the documents with an expression that suggested he had been dreading this conversation. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who handled displaced persons processing, sat in the corner taking notes, her face carefully neutral. Sergeant Blake stood by the door, and Corporal Fisher remained as translator, though the tension in the room made translation feel inadequate for what needed to be said. On the wall behind Garrett's desk hung a large map of occupied Germany, its surface divided by thick lines marking the 4 zones of control: American, British, French, and Soviet. The Soviet zone, colored in red, occupied the eastern third of the country, the largest single section. Morrison walked to the map and placed his finger on Bavaria, where they stood deep in the American zone. Then he traced the route the train would take, east through the American sector, across the zonal boundary and into Soviet-controlled territory near Leipzig. The journey was perhaps 300 kilometers, but the distance wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in the crossing of that boundary line, the moment when American authority ended and Soviet authority began. "These 43 men," Morrison said, his finger still on the map, "are designated for repatriation because their homes of origin fall within the Soviet occupation zone. According to the Yalta Agreement, we are required to return them to Soviet authority for processing and eventual return to their communities." He paused, looking at the red section of the map as if it might offer answers. But these letters suggest that what we're calling repatriation is actually something else. We're handing men over to a system that views Western contact as collaboration, that treats time in American custody as evidence of espionage. Major Garrett's jaw tightened. He was 51 years old, a career officer who had served in the First World War and returned for this one, and he carried the weariness of someone who had seen too many impossible situations dressed up as policy. "Captain Morrison," he said carefully, "I understand your concern. I've read the letters, but we don't have the authority to simply refuse repatriation based on unverified accounts from refugees. The agreement between the Allied powers is clear. We return displaced persons and prisoners to their zones of origin. The Soviets do the same with people found in their territory who belong in ours." "Sir," Morrison said, "these aren't unverified accounts. We have dozens of letters, all describing the same pattern: immediate detention, accusations of collaboration, disappearances, camps in the East. At what point does consistency become evidence?" He gestured to Klaus's letter, lying on top of the pile. "This man's brother is telling him that coming home means arrest or worse. How do we justify forcing him onto that train knowing what we know?" Lieutenant Chen spoke up from the corner, her voice quiet but firm. "The problem is jurisdiction, isn't it? Once we cross that line," she pointed to the zonal boundary on the map, "we have no authority, no oversight, no way to ensure these men are treated according to the Geneva Convention or any other standard. We're operating on the assumption that the Soviets will process them fairly, but we have no mechanism to verify that assumption. We're taking it on faith." "We're taking it on treaty," Garrett corrected, but his tone lacked conviction. "The Allied powers agreed to mutual repatriation. If we start refusing to return people to the Soviet zone, they'll start refusing to return people to ours. The whole system breaks down." He walked to the map and studied it, his expression troubled. "But I'll admit, these letters are disturbing. If even half of what they describe is true, we're putting men at serious risk." Morrison felt a surge of frustration. "Sir, with respect, we're past if. These men are sitting on that platform refusing to board because they have information we don't. They have family members who've tried to warn them. They understand something about what's happening in the Soviet zone that our official reports aren't telling us." He picked up Ernst's letter and held it up. "This man says sending people east is not mercy. That's not propaganda or exaggeration. That's someone risking his life to get a warning west." The room fell silent. Sergeant Blake shifted uncomfortably by the door. Fisher stared at the map as if trying to find a solution in its colored zones and boundary lines. Major Garrett rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking much older than 51. Finally, he spoke. "What are you proposing, Captain? That we refuse the repatriation order? That we keep 43 men in custody indefinitely in violation of international agreements and direct commands from division?" His tone wasn't hostile, just exhausted. The voice of a man who saw the moral problem clearly, but couldn't see a solution that didn't end in court-martial or diplomatic crisis. Morrison looked at the map again, at the line separating American and Soviet control, and understood that this line represented more than military zones. It represented two different visions of what post-war order should look like, two different systems with fundamentally different values, and men like Klaus, caught between those systems, were being crushed in the gap. "I'm proposing we delay," Morrison said. "We tell command we need more time to verify the prisoners' claims. We investigate these letters, contact other camps, find out if this is an isolated problem or a systematic one. We don't send anyone east until we understand what we're sending them into." Garrett studied Morrison for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 48 hours, he said. "I'll tell command we have concerns about the prisoners' welfare that require investigation. But Morrison, if you're going to challenge this repatriation, you'd better have more than letters. You need testimony, witnesses, something concrete that justifies defying orders." He paused, his expression grim. "And you should know that even if you find it, we might still be ordered to proceed anyway. Sometimes the machinery is bigger than the individuals caught in it." Morrison spent the next day doing something he should have done months earlier. He talked to people who had actually been to the Soviet zone and come back. It wasn't easy to find them. Most refugees who escaped west didn't advertise their status, fearing the Soviets might demand their return. But Fisher knew the displaced persons network, knew which barracks housed the people who had stories they were afraid to tell. By evening, Morrison had found 3 men willing to speak, and what they described turned his remaining doubts to ash. The first was a man named Werner Braun, 47 years old, who had been repatriated to Soviet-controlled territory in February and escaped back across the zonal boundary in April. He sat across from Morrison in an empty office, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "They took us off the train at the border checkpoint," Werner said, his voice flat with the exhaustion of someone who had told this story before and knew no one wanted to hear it. Anyone who had been in American or British custody was separated into a different group. They said it was just processing, just paperwork. But the paperwork never ended. Werner described being taken to a facility outside Magdeburg, a converted factory that now served as a detention center for returnees. He was interrogated for 3 days. Who did he speak to in the American camp? What questions did the Americans ask? Did they offer him anything in exchange for information? Did he see any Soviet prisoners in American custody? What did he tell the Americans about life in Germany? The questions came in shifts, different interrogators asking the same things in different ways, looking for inconsistencies that could be labeled as lies or evasion. "They wanted me to confess that I was a spy," Werner said, smoke curling from his cigarette. "They kept saying that any German who spent time in Western custody had been compromised, that the Americans don't just feed you and let you go without getting something in return. They said cooperation now would be treated more leniently than resistance." He laughed bitterly. "Cooperation meant signing a confession that I had provided intelligence to the Americans. Resistance meant being sent east for re-education." He stubbed out his cigarette. "I signed. Most of us signed. What choice did we have?" After signing, Werner was told he would be sent to a labor camp in the Urals for 2 years of re-education work. He was loaded onto a train with 40 other men, all former prisoners of war who had been repatriated from Western custody. The train traveled east for 3 days before making a stop in a town whose name Werner never learned. During that stop, guards were distracted by a fight between prisoners in another car, and Werner slipped away, making his way west on foot for 6 weeks, sleeping in barns, stealing food, avoiding checkpoints, until he crossed back into the American zone half-starved but alive. "The men I was with on that train," Werner said quietly. "They're gone. Maybe they're in camps somewhere in Russia. Maybe they're dead. I don't know. But I know they're not home with their families like the repatriation papers promised." He looked directly at Morrison. "If you send those men on that platform east, you're sending them to the same fate. They're right to refuse. They understand what you're just learning, that the war didn't end the same way for everyone." The second witness was younger, a man named Stefan Koch, who had been repatriated in March and escaped in May. His testimony was similar, but included additional details that made Morrison's stomach turn. The systematic confiscation of any letters or documents prisoners carried, the separation of men who had skills the Soviets considered valuable, the rumors of prisoners being sent not just to labor camps, but to technical facilities where their knowledge of Western operations could be extracted. Stefan had watched a man who spoke fluent English being taken from the group, told he would be useful in translation services. The man had screamed that he wasn't a translator, that he had just worked in a camp kitchen, but he was dragged away anyway. The third witness was the most disturbing because he hadn't been a soldier. His name was Otto Fischer, no relation to the translator, and he had been a civilian administrator in a town that fell under Soviet control. He was arrested in January, accused of collaborating with Western interests, because his town had briefly been occupied by American forces before the final zonal boundaries were set. He was held for 2 months, interrogated about what he had told the Americans, what information he had provided. When he insisted he had only helped coordinate food distribution and hadn't provided any intelligence, his interrogators became more aggressive. He was released only because his sister managed to bribe the right officials, but he was told to report weekly to Soviet authorities. Instead, he fled west. "They're not just targeting former soldiers," Otto said, his voice shaking. "They're targeting anyone who had contact with Western forces, Teachers who taught in American-occupied areas, administrators who worked with British officials, even family members of people who went west are being questioned. He looked at Morrison with hollow eyes. The Soviets are terrified of Western influence spreading into their zone. They're treating contact with Americans or British as a form of contamination that needs to be eliminated. Morrison listened to all three testimonies, Fisher translating when the men lapsed into rapid German, and felt the weight of institutional denial lifting away to reveal something uglier underneath. The repatriation system wasn't failing accidentally. It was working exactly as designed, delivering vulnerable people to a system that viewed them as security threats. Morrison compiled the testimonies into a report and presented it to Major Garrett that evening. The Major read through it in silence, his expression growing darker with each page, then set it down and stared at his desk for a long time before speaking. "This is damning," he said finally. "If even half of this is accurate, we've been complicit in delivering people to imprisonment or worse." He looked up at Morrison, and there was genuine anguish in his eyes. "But you understand what happens if we refuse to carry out repatriation orders. We'll be accused of violating the Yalta Agreement, of harboring German prisoners in defiance of international law, of creating a diplomatic incident with the Soviets. Command will demand court-martial proceedings. Our careers will end, and the orders will be carried out anyway by officers more willing to follow them." Morrison had expected this response, had spent hours anticipating it, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a blow. "Sir, I understand the consequences, but I also understand what those men on the platform understand, that we're asking them to choose between certain imprisonment here and probable death there. And we're calling that choice repatriation." He leaned forward. "The Geneva Convention requires humane treatment of prisoners. How is handing men over to a system that will imprison them for the crime of being in our custody consistent with that requirement? The Geneva Convention also requires repatriation at the end of hostilities," Garrett countered, but his tone was weary rather than argumentative. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the camp where the 43 men were still sitting on the platform, still refusing to board, now entering their second night of passive resistance. "Morrison, I fought in the last war. I thought we learned something from it. I thought this time we'd build a better peace." He was quiet for a moment. "But peace turns out to be just as complicated as war, and sometimes more morally ambiguous." Outside, Sergeant Blake and Lieutenant Chen were dealing with the practical consequences of the delayed repatriation. The prisoners needed food, water, medical attention. They couldn't sit on that platform indefinitely. Blake had arranged for supplies to be brought to them, and Chen had convinced them to move to a nearby barracks where they could wait more comfortably while the investigation proceeded. But the fundamental problem remained. They were scheduled for repatriation, and eventually someone would order that repatriation to be carried out by force, if necessary. The soldiers tasked with guarding the prisoners were struggling with their own moral crisis. These were young men, most in their early 20s, who had spent the last 2 years fighting a war they believed was about liberation and justice. They had seen the concentration camps, had helped free the survivors, had looked into the eyes of people who had been systematically dehumanized and sworn that this was why they fought, to end that kind of cruelty. Now they were being asked to force men onto trains that would take them to a different kind of imprisonment, and the contradiction was tearing at them. Private David Sullivan, who had been assigned to the platform detail, came to Morrison that night with a request that surprised no one who knew him. "Sir," he said, standing at attention in Morrison's temporary office, "I'm requesting to be reassigned from repatriation duty. I can't be part of forcing those men onto trains, not after what I've heard about what happens to them." His young face was set with determination, but Morrison could see the fear underneath. Fear of consequences, fear of being seen as a coward, fear of disappointing the men he served with. "I'll accept whatever punishment that brings, sir, but I can't do it." Morrison looked at the young private and saw the same moral struggle he himself was facing, multiplied across dozens of soldiers who were realizing that following orders sometimes meant betraying the principles they thought they were fighting for. "You're not the only one, Sullivan," Morrison said quietly. Half the men on this detail have come to me with the same request. They don't want to be part of this." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I've recommended to Major Garrett that we delay the repatriation pending further investigation, but I can't promise that delay will become a cancellation. Command may still order us to proceed." Sullivan's expression tightened. "Then what do we do, sir? Do we follow orders that we know will harm these men, or do we refuse and face court-martial?" The question hung in the air between them, and Morrison realized that Sullivan was asking not just for guidance, but for permission to do what his conscience demanded. Morrison had no answer that satisfied either of them because there was no good answer. The machinery of post-war order was larger than individual conscience, and sometimes the gears crushed people regardless of intentions. What happened next occurred across 3 days that felt like 3 years, each hour weighted with decisions that would define lives and deaths for men caught between two empires. Major Garrett sent Morrison's report up the chain of command, including the testimonies, the letters, and a formal recommendation to suspend repatriations to the Soviet zone pending investigation of treatment standards. The response came back within 48 hours. The repatriation would proceed as scheduled. The Yalta Agreement allowed no exceptions, and any further delay would result in disciplinary action. Morrison walked out to the barracks where the 43 men waited, and told them through Fisher that he had tried, that he had documented their fears, but that the decision had been made above his authority. Some of the men wept, others simply nodded, as if they had expected this outcome all along. Klaus Müller looked at Morrison with an expression that wasn't quite accusation, but was close, and asked through the translator, "Will you remember us?" Morrison promised he would, though the promise felt hollow. The next morning, military police arrived from outside the camp, men who hadn't spent months with these prisoners, who saw them only as names on a manifest. They gave the prisoners 30 minutes to gather their belongings and board the transport trucks. Morrison watched from a distance, bearing witness because it was the only thing left he could do. Some prisoners walked to the trucks with a dignity that broke Morrison's heart. Others had to be physically assisted, their bodies unable to cooperate with the command to move toward their own potential destruction. Klaus was among the last to board, still holding the photograph of his brother. But not all 43 men boarded that day. Through bureaucratic confusion, sympathetic officers who processed paperwork slowly, and prisoners who demonstrated medical conditions requiring evaluation, 11 men avoided the immediate transport. Over the following months, as the full scale of Soviet treatment became undeniable even to Allied command, repatriation policies began to shift. The 11 who avoided that first transport all survived, though they carried the guilt of survival. The 32 men who boarded disappeared into the Soviet zone. Years later, after Stalin's death, some information filtered back. Ernst Müller, Klaus's brother who had written the warning letter, had been arrested and sent to Kazakhstan, where he died in 1948. Klaus survived 5 years in Siberian labor camps and was released in 1951, his health destroyed. Of the 32 men on that transport, at least 12 died in Soviet custody within 2 years. Morrison remained in Germany for another year, carrying the weight of that June morning for the rest of his life. The story of those 43 prisoners became one of thousands of similar stories from the post-war period, moments when international agreements crushed individuals caught in the machinery. The Yalta Agreement had been designed to create order, but in practice it created a mechanism for delivering vulnerable people to imprisonment or death. The moral weight of those orders never left Morrison, a reminder that sometimes peace is won at a cost the victors prefer not to count.